despite the dehumanization. How are they able to do this? I'm going to cite just one example. It's an example that will be known to many of you because he's an articulate example and an important example. I'm going to cite the words of Andrzej Szeptycki, who was, of course, the metropolitan of the Greek Catholic Church, and who in western Ukraine, in Galicia, was responsible, along with his brother Clementi, for saving about, or at least 100 Jews, mostly children. Andrzej Szeptycki, in explaining what he did and in recommending what others should do, cited a very simple part of the New Testament. He cited the parable of the Good Samaritan. I'm sure you all know the parable of the Good Samaritan. It's about a Jew who has been robbed by thieves, who is lying, bleeding in a ditch, as it happens, lying, bleeding by the side of the road, and other Jews walk by and don't help him. But he is helped by an other. He's helped by a Samaritan. He's helped by someone who belongs to a different and hostile group. So, in the New Testament, in the Gospel of Luke, Jesus tells this story, and then he asks his disciples, he's telling this story because his disciples have asked him, who is my neighbor, right? So he tells the story to answer the question. And then he asks his disciples, who is my neighbor? And he answers the question, he that showed mercy. He that showed mercy. And then Jesus says, go and do likewise. Now, I find many things interesting and quite profound in this particular citation. One of them is that this is an encounter. The parable of the Good Samaritan is an encounter between someone who can help and someone who needs help. People who belong and see themselves as belonging to different groups. The Samaritan helps the Jew. The other thing which I find, and that's of course telling, right, that Szeptycki, a Ukrainian, is telling other Ukrainians, right, what neighborhood means on the example of the Good Samaritan. But there's something even deeper going on here. Because what is happening in the parable of the Good Samaritan is not that a Christian is talking to other Christians. There isn't Christianity yet, right? What's happening in the parable of the Good Samaritan is that a Jew is talking to other Jews about Jewish law. What they're discussing is Leviticus chapter 19, verse 18, and Jesus is talking to his disciples about which law is the most important. And in the larger conversation is that after loving God, the most important commandment is to love thy neighbor. So even as we plumb what Christians say to other Christians about a neighborhood, about why one should help Jews during the Holocaust, because this is what Szeptycki said during the Holocaust. He cites the parable of the Good Samaritan during the Holocaust. We find immediately that we're in a conversation that has to do with Jews, that there is no level of this conversation, of this event, where there's not an encounter between Christians and Jews. Which brings me to where I want to close modestly and as a proposition with the question of how we might remember. How might we remember these events? Let me begin by saying a word about forgetting, because these events, in particular the events of Babi Yar, the events of the Holocaust in the East in general, were actively forgotten. Were forgotten as a matter of policy almost as soon as they were happening. The Nazis themselves, as you could see in some of the photographs, brought Soviet prisoners of war in August of 1943 to the site to try to remove the bodies. The Soviets, in their own internal reporting to themselves, Karl Berkhoff has written a wonderful article about this, the Soviets, in their own internal reporting to themselves and then in their press, tended to suppress the fact, the basic fact, that the victims of Babi Yar in September 1941 were Jews. The physical site, as all of you Kievans will know, was altered and destroyed and is no longer what it was. Beyond that, there is also a nationalist story here in Ukraine among Ukrainian nationalists, just as there was in other places in Eastern Europe among other local nationalists, which was a variety of forgetting. a nationalist story which says the Jews deserved it and therefore nothing has happened, right? That is also a form of forgetting. And then finally, there is a Western form of forgetting, which we in some measure have tried to bring to you in the last 25 years. And that form of forgetting is to say, the Holocaust was only Auschwitz, and Auschwitz was a kind of mechanized killing. Auschwitz was, of course, a tremendously central part of the Holocaust, but it happens later. It happens after Babi Yar. It happens after the mass killing in the Soviet Union has begun. And when we limit the Holocaust to Auschwitz and we think of it as mechanized, we are removing the question or the confrontation with individual human responsibility. How then should we try to remember? I think all of us, and this is universal, Ukrainians, people in the West, Russians, Poles, everyone, has some duty to think about these general causes, the ones that I cited or perhaps others. If we believe that a colonial war for resources was one of the causes, then we have good reason ourselves to consider our own physical environment and the reasons why people might be inspired for future wars of resources, because I'm afraid such things are not at all out of the question. If we believe that ideology, that exterminatory anti-Semitism is a cause, then we have one more very good reason to be concerned about the unmistakable rise of the extreme right in politics, whether that be in the United States, in Russia, in Poland, or anywhere else. It's a phenomenon with which we all have very good reasons to be concerned. If we believe that lawlessness, statelessness, is one of the causes of the Holocaust, then we have very good reason to be concerned about the integrity of our states, our Israeli state, our Ukrainian state. We have very good reason to be concerned about the future of the European Union, which is before all things and above all things, an instrument for keeping European states functional. The only such instrument, by the way, that has ever been found. There is no history of European nation states, no happy history in any event. The nostalgia that populists in Western Europe and Eastern Europe express for the 1920s and 1930s is a nostalgia for an abyss. The nation state in the 1920s and 1930s failed everyone, not just its citizens, but it failed Europe itself. So if we believe that lawlessness is the cause of the Holocaust, then we have all the more reason to be concerned with that. Finally, the most difficult and the most subtle question, and one with which I will close, is the question of neighborliness. What does it mean to remember the Holocaust as a matter of human rights, or as a matter of humanity, or as Sheptytsky might have put it, as a matter of one's neighbor, of neighborliness? We cannot, of course, we should not, of course, forget the Stalinist crimes which are carried out on the territory of Ukraine. The Holodomor, the Great Terror of 1937 and 1938, for that matter, the deportations and murders in what's now Western Ukraine associated with the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. We cannot forget the Soviet role in the war itself. We cannot forget that the Soviet Union was the first state that was willing to become a military ally of Nazi Germany, and therefore helped Nazi Germany politically, morally, materially to begin the Second World War in Europe in 1939. We cannot forget and must notice the political habits of Soviet people which continued on under German occupation, the habit of denunciation, for example. And of course, we cannot forget, shifting a bit, we cannot forget the other Ukrainian victims of German crimes. We cannot forget the other people who were murdered in Babi Yar, as Professor Nagoshi said. We cannot forget the Soviet prisoners of war. We cannot forget the mentally ill, the handicapped. We cannot forget the people who believed they were fighting for a sovereign, independent Ukraine who were killed in retribution. That said, or all of that said, I think it's very important to remember that we cannot forget those things, not just because we're concerned with the history of Ukrainians. I would say that even those who were only concerned or primarily concerned with the history of the Holocaust should remember those things. Because without those things, without the Soviet backdrop, without the other German crimes, the Holocaust makes even less sense. The Holocaust is even harder to understand, or perhaps better. The lives of the Jews that are lost in the Holocaust cannot make sense unless we know something about where they came from, among whom they lived, and sometimes around whom they died. But then to turn the point around the other way, even if all we're concerned about is Ukrainian history, even if that is our subject, or our memory, or identity, Ukrainian history cannot make sense, does not make sense, without the history and the memory of the Holocaust. Now, in this talk, I've stressed that there were larger causes of the Holocaust. And of course there were. A German war, a German ideology, a German practice of destroying states and laws. It would make no sense to ask Ukrainians to bear responsibility for all of that. And yet, I think, it's true of Ukrainians, it's true of Poles, it's true of everyone. If you choose to bear no responsibility, then you're also choosing not to have a history. Some responsibility must be borne. And where that some and what that some responsibility is a question which has to do with defining yourself as a nation. I think this is the case for Ukrainians, as I believe it's the case for everyone in Europe. Or, to put the matter a slightly different way, we cannot think that addition is subtraction if we add to the Holocaust the suffering of other Ukrainians under German rule. If we add to that the suffering of Ukrainians under Soviet rule. That is not a subtraction from the Holocaust. If we remember that about 100,000 people were killed at Babi Yar, that is not a subtraction from the 33,771 who were killed on those first 2 days. Now I stress that for Ukrainians now, as I believe this is true generally, but I should stress I'm offering this modestly as a proposition, remembering the Holocaust in this way is not so much a duty to others, it's a duty to oneself to remember the Holocaust in this way. Let me return to try to conclude this point, and then my lecture to Sheptytsky. What Sheptytsky said in citing the parable of the Good Samaritan, citing the Gospel of Luke, he said, "He who loves his neighbor in this fashion, in this way, will bring a blessing upon himself and upon his village." There's an idea of neighborhood here, himself, his village. There's also an idea of nationhood here, because as we know, Sheptytsky was very concerned, perhaps above all concerned, with the souls of his flock, which he regarded as the Ukrainian nation. Nations are built not upon forgetfulness, but upon responsibility. And in this sense, it's never too late, I think, to show mercy upon the living, but also mercy upon the dead. All of them, but at certain times and places, like for example here on this day of commemoration, for the Jews above all, for the people whom Sheptytsky called the first victims. Thank you very much.
Шановні пані і панове, разом з моїм колегою і добрим другом, професором Гаусманом, ми маємо честь і приємність модерувати цю дискусію. Є такий короткий ремарка до того, що казав пан професор Тімоті Снайдер. коли читаєш рецензію на його книжку, особливо Bloodlands, то дуже багато рецензентів говорять про те, що чому його книжка така добра, тому що професор Тімоті Снайдер вільно володіє, розмовляє 11 мовами. Серед тих 11 мов є українська. Він рад, що як професор Снайдер розмовляє українською. Тут у нас є в залі мікрофони зліва і справа. Зараз я прошу вас, хто хоче ставити питання до цих мікрофонів. Тільки я для цього сказав, що той, кому зручніше розпитатися українською мовою, чути себе вільно, питатися українською, професор Снайдер вас добре зрозуміє. Ми будемо проводити дискусію в такий спосіб, що ми будемо збирати по 2-3 питання, тоді будуть відповіді, і тоді буде далі раунд питань. Отже, прошу ваші питання, прошу ваші руки. Хочу. Професор Андрес Унланд, Київсько-Могилянський університет, академія.
Yeah, a short question. You indicated when you mentioned the police, the German police, the role of the German police in the Holocaust. Would you be able to make, or would you be willing to make a comment on this argument that we had in Germany about the book by Daniel Goldhagen, Hitler's Willing Executioners? You know, the debate basically whether the Holocaust should be regarded as a German project rather than a Nazi project.
Дякую. Прошу ще питання.
Прошу питання.
Прошу вас.
Пане професоре,
Назвіться, прошу. Назвіться.
Андрій Ткачук, історик. Скажіть, будь ласка, чому, як відомо, згідно плану Барбаросса, всі великі міста підлягали знищенню, бомбардуванню авіацією і артилерією? Київ – єдине місто, на 4-й день війни міст був розбомблений, скажімо. Єдине місто, яке німці не бомбардували і не обстрілювали з артилерії. Вони могли дуже легко це зробити. Чому все-таки Гітлер, очевидно, дав наказ Київ не розбомбити і не розстріляти з артилерії в 41-му році?
Дякую. І останнє питання, прошу. Прошу вас. Назвіться, прошу.
My name is Ian Bateson. I'm a journalist. You were talking a little bit about the Germans and trying to destroy memory after Babyn Yar, desecrating the site. I'm just curious if you could talk a bit about the significance of remembering now, because it seems after Maidan, with the accusations in Russian propaganda of Kiev being, a fascist junta, that talking about Babyn Yar, talking about anti-Semitism takes on a special significance. So I was just curious if we could talk about memory and remembering also in a modern context.
Я прошу професора Снайдера відповісти.
Okay, thank you very much for these questions. On the question about military history, I'm going to pass. I mean, my guess would be the bridges over the Dnipro, but I'm going to pass that on to more talented military historians. On the question about memory today, it's a very difficult one to answer, because you have to first step back into a different world. The rhetoric. Where's the person who asked that question? There you are. The rhetoric that you're describing, one has to make a lot of effort to place that rhetoric, right? Because it's of course so easy to say, to put in a couple of sentences, as you said, the Russians say this, and then here we are commemorating Babyn Yar. But there are many things that are strange that one has to first signal, right? One is to say that when Russia's invading Ukraine, Russia starts the invasion by denying the legality of the Ukrainian state, right? no one points out why this is so problematic. I mean, many people point out that it's a bad thing to destroy the European order and the post-war order and the Helsinki order. But as far as I know, no one points out that destroying states or denying the reality of states is a bad thing because that's what we did in the 1930s. Okay, there were some people, right? I mean, Andrei Zubov in Russia makes this point. But when we start talking, see, I'm just saying that I prefer not to start from where they start, because from where they start's a very strange place. What I would start with is that event, that denying the legitimacy of the Ukrainian state, as President Putin and as Foreign Minister Lavrov and as many others did in March and April of 2014, was a very dark moment, right? Not because it was exactly like the 1930s, but because it recalled something of the 1930s. The idea that your neighboring state doesn't really exist, is somehow not really legally equal. The second thing which is worth pointing out is that a number of the people who make these claims, which I'm not going to use the words because the words strike me as obscene, that a number of people who make these claims are themselves fascists, right? Are themselves representatives of the extreme right. And this pattern of people from the extreme right labeling other people fascists has the consequence, first of all, of confusing, that confuses the world press generally. But it also denudes the term fascism of any meaning, right? A fascist calling a non-fascist a fascist makes a mockery of the whole history that one is trying so carefully to describe. So I say all that by way of preface. I mean, I understand your question. I'm not trying to give you a hard time, but I say all that by way of preface because it seems to me that one has to make a certain effort to return to reality, right?
Well, I'm just curious because you're talking about state memory, right? In terms of the Nazis trying to destroy the site because they were concerned about how it could be remembered and affected them. Right. And you had a Soviet version which turns, Babyn Yar or the Holocaust into something that affected all Soviet citizens, so it removes the Jewish element. Then you have Ukraine today, which is addressing this, I mean, in part because it's a historical injustice, but also in part because there's been these recent consequences. So I'm just curious how you see the history of state memory and that significance.
Yeah, I mean, I'm going to leave it to others to judge, what Ukraine is doing, because here I am taking part in it. But it seems, and I think it's what I tend to think is that, and I tried to express it at the end, is that this is part of a nation-building process, right? That if Poland, I'm going to move things out of Ukraine for a minute to take the pressure off. If Poland has a debate about Jedwabne, right, about the killing of Jews in Jedwabne in the years 2000, 2001, 2002, that is building a Polish nation in a certain way. If in the year 2016, Polish elected officials then start to question the role of Poles in the killing of Jedwabne, that is also building the Polish nation, just in a different way, right? In a way that perhaps we like less. I tend to think, as an outsider, that efforts like this are building the Ukrainian nation in a certain way rather than another way. With respect to Russia, the policy of exporting responsibility of the Holocaust, right, of treating the Holocaust as something that other people have to explain, but we don't. That seems to me to be something new in the history of Holocaust remembrance, the policy of pure export. But I mean, I hope and I expect that this is a temporary phenomenon, because I'm deeply convinced that no nation, and I begin from my own, right? I mean, no nation can possibly have a healthy sense of its own society without grappling with the more difficult aspects of its past. There's always the temptation to say, why should we do this? Because not everyone is doing it, right? If you're a Pole or Ukrainian, you can always say, why should we do this, right? Someone else is just going to use this against us. Someone is just going to use this to call us names, like you said. If we admit that there were Ukrainians who took part in the Holocaust, someone would just use this against us. And I've heard, Polish government officials say this quite openly. Why should we do this? But once you make that move, you're accepting that all that matters is memory wars, and that history itself doesn't matter. And once you move into the world of memory wars, you're building the nation in a certain way. That's a choice you're making. If you decide instead to take part in this kind of activity, which involves understanding, the Holocaust as a whole, difficult histories as a whole, one's own responsibility being somewhere in there, then you're building the nation in a different way.
I just would like...
Sorry. There's so many difficult questions. Andreas Umland asked about the thesis of our colleague Daniel Jonah Goldhagen in a book, Hitler's Willing Executioners. Let me start by saying where I think Daniel Goldhagen made an enormous contribution. Daniel Goldhagen made an enormous contribution in his claim, which is correct, that the Holocaust was not a matter of some kind of isolated project in camps that no one knew about. Daniel Goldhagen pointed out that Germans of many institutions took part, and he stressed that much of the killing happened outside of the killing facilities, in ditches, in death marches, and so on. And that is to his credit. He played a very positive role, I think, in opening the debate about the Holocaust out towards the other forms of killing. And I would agree with your summation of his book that the Holocaust was a German project rather than a Nazi project. That is to say, many of the Germans who killed were not Nazis, right? And German society was implicated in all